FM Scotland, 16.8.
Good afternoon. I am here at Mounds Park in Anderson, Indiana today, speaking with John Sherman, who is an Indiana poet, and we're heading into National Poetry Month. So John and I have met at a poetry workshop earlier in March, and he has very kindly agreed to talking with me today about poetry. So John, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
To get this interview going. So first thing I'm going to have you do is share with the audience some of your background. When you started writing poetry, what got you interested in it? Anything you want to say about your career as a poet and as a writer, photographer, lots of different arms that you have enjoyed in the creative process.
Well, I'm a native Hoosier, raised on a farm in Jay County, northeastern Indiana, and my poetry is about a lot of different topics. Primarily, it's personal reflections and observations, as much poetry is, on my having lived overseas in many different countries, particularly in Africa. But I'm always grounded in that Indiana farm, that small family farm. And my third book of poetry is entitled Marjorie Main. And the title poem is about not only mentioning the Moll Kettle character that we all knew and loved, but the fact that my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was really Moll Kettle. I mean, in terms of her cooking and house cleaning and so on like that, and delightfully so. So I began writing poetry. I would say I seriously began writing it when, after college, I wrote some in high school and some in college, most of which I later threw away.
Do you ever regret throwing some of those away?
Well,
or you think they're so they were maybe so elementary that you wouldn't have given them a second glance?
Well, I did have, after I did that, now these were on a typewriter with no carbon copies, so when I threw them away, I threw them away. There was no backup drive or anything, right? So I thought afterwards exactly that. I thought, did I do the right thing? I happened to find one more poem from that era. I read it, I crumpled it up, and I said, yes, I did the right thing. Now, when I speak to high school, I go out and talk to a lot of high school kids, particularly middle school and high school. And I'll say to them, if I tell them that story, because I'm a little hesitant to do so, I say, don't do that now. Wait several years. Put it away somewhere if you're not sure, if you don't like it. But don't do that now, because you may regret it. And I don't want you to destroy something that later you really wouldn't have wanted to. So, but with years gone by, we'll see.
You never know. And and I would think too, some topics you could, as a high school student, let's say, you have a certain emotion, and to revisit that whenever you are, let's say at the height of your career, 30 years later, you might still have that emotion or still have that situational interest, but the emotion attached to it would be so much different that you could almost make a kind of a comparative poem about the same subject. You know, I would think there'd be lots of ways you could kind of revisit those early attempts.
Exactly.
So,
and one thing too that students find very puzzling at first, and then they're intrigued by it, and then I sort of give them permission, shall we say, to do something, is that when I was in high school, I tell them, I said, I thought you had to write about love and death, and I mean, all these, topics like that. And then I discovered that some of my favorite works of other people and of my own are about very ordinary kinds of things. And you can take a very everyday sort of thing and write about that, and that can be turned into a very powerful piece of work.
Well, and whenever you and I were in school, or I say you and I, but a certain generation, poems had to rhyme.
Yes.
It was like you had the iambic pentameter, the certain meter, and they had to rhyme. And there was not a whole lot of room for expression when we were learning about poetry in elementary and high school. Now, if you look at the poets who were already published poets during our time, they didn't always rhyme, but they were not as abstract as some of the poetry became later. Especially I think probably in the 80s and 90s. It was kind of like the trends for art. Art needed to look like what it was looking like until someone like Picasso or Dali, some of the abstract artists came along and realized that this art can be a different expression by a different person. So I think probably poetry kind of evolved in that same way.
Well, and I don't, my poems do not rhyme, and I don't use capitalization or punctuation. And so that throws people sometimes, whether they're these kids that I'm talking about or someone else who's reading them. And one of the most fascinating things I find is that if I go into a classroom and I've emailed some poems ahead of time for them to look at and so on, and then so they've had a chance to do so, and then I'll read a handful of those or others. Then I call for volunteers to read poems that we haven't yet read. And it's the first time that happened, I was just blown away. I'm still surprised because, of course, it's never how I would have read it. They interpret it differently. They pause where I wouldn't pause. They don't pause where I do pause or whatever. But I never, ever read that poem in that class after they've read it because I would have to read it the way I read it. And it sounds as if I'm correcting them because I'm reading it how it's supposed to be read. So I never
so there's
do
really
so.
not, even with your poetry in particular, there's not a defined way to read it. It's basically the interpretation of the reader rather than the interpretation of the writer. You wrote it. You knew the intent when you wrote it, but it's for the reader to pick up the meaning that they get out of it, rather than find your meaning. It's to find their meaning. I think that's very interesting. Before we have you read some poems, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your work in Africa. You studied in Ghana. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it affected what you wrote after your experience in Africa?
Okay. Well, I'd have to back up a couple of years because I first went to Africa out of college. I graduated from IU, Indiana University, with a double major in English and journalism on Monday. And Saturday, I was in Peace Corps training of that same week in Atlanta to go to Nigeria as an English teacher. So I went to Nigeria and what was then the eastern region near Port Harcourt down in the southeastern part of the country. At the time that it was leading up to what became secession, that part of the country seceded, became Biafra, and the Civil War began, and so we were evacuated. I went to Malawi, came back to work with the Red Cross, came back home, got married. My wife joined the Foreign Service. She'd also been in Peace Corps, and we went to Ghana, and that's where I began. That's where I studied, did graduate work at the University of Ghana in African literature. Okay. And later we moved to what was then called Zaire, is now called Republic of the Congo, living in Kinshasa, where our daughter was born, and then came back to the U.S. And so I've been back and forth to Africa since then, but not living. So I spent about 8 years living in Africa.
And one thing, people think of Africa as being Africa, and they think that all the parts of Africa are the same, but it's as diverse a country as you'll find anywhere in the world, from what I understand. So how in terms, you're a photographer, and so I'm sure there's a lot of your photography that came out of Africa also. How did your writing change from when you were in one place or another? Did the cultural differences affect your poetry that was produced when you were in Africa?
Yes, I would say so. This is when, as I mentioned, I first really began, when I was in Peace Corps, I really began writing poetry. And as an English teacher, you're always, of course, very busy grading papers and teaching class and all that sort of thing. But I was very motivated to write poetry, and the subject matter, of course, a lot of it focused on Africa. And my second book was called, poetry was called America as a Negro Child, subtitled Race Poems. A lot of those poems were written in Africa and or were about Africa and various kinds of things, whether it was that Civil War that I was involved in, or whether it was, observations of other things and so on, and also a lot about race relations in the U.S. So, so the subject matter first of all, but also just I think I was maturing in the way that I was writing and working on my style of writing and things like that. So it was very influential in terms of being in a place where you're very far from that home base that you had in that little family farm. And yet I wrote a lot of the poems I wrote about that family farm were written in, say, Kinshasa or Accra or somewhere in Nigeria or something like that, because that distance gives you perspective that you might not have if you were always on that farm,
Well, and I imagine that within those places that you were, there were also parallels for family farms. It translated from Indiana to someplace in Africa. That people, and it would let us know that people and experiences to some degree are the same no matter where we are in the world. So I think that sounds like a very interesting aspect of your poems. Do you have a couple that you could read to us about? You mentioned Marjorie Main. Why don't we maybe start with that one, if that's possible, and we'll just kind of go from there and talk about Marjorie Main. So, for those of you who have not experienced the Ma and Pa Kettle movies, I would strongly recommend that you go to YouTube and any Ma and Pa Kettle movie, you will understand. They were charming, lovely movies, and Ma had a lot on the ball. Yes. But housekeeping was not her strong suit because they had, how many kids did they have? Like 13 or 15 or I don't think they did either. But it was a good group of movies because there were several of those movies. So if you would share, please.
Okay, yes. Yeah, this is the title poem of the book, titled Marjorie Main. I am Marjorie Main, Ma kettling her kids to come and get it, with a fervor matched only by my grandfather railing at Republicans. There is so much of me growing up and seeing Ma Kettle and her rocking chair husband yell their way through yet another movie while I giggled and hid my face in guffaws and juji fruits. That is me growing up because my grandmother was Marjorie Main, or at least a damn good look-alike, with her white hair, her square jaw set to yell at people in the next room, or because she was a bit deaf, right in your ears you bent over the potato salad once again. She looked like the mountain people that old lady Maine represented, her lack of good teeth setting her mouth in from the rest of her face, her white hair in wisp around her ears, her stance not quite genteel, but more hard and necessary and rural, as she yelled at Grandpa to come in from the barn to eat noontime dinner. She puttered in her Ma Kettle kitchen, setting out dishes of things to eat that would drive a gourmet wild. Kool-Aid without sugar because it was forgot. Ham fried and salted until it curled in desperate but useless self-defense. The silverware kept in a glass in the middle of the heavy wooden table, and newspapers spread over everything after every meal to keep the flies from getting what was left. My uncles in from the fields slurped their coffee with my grandfather, pouring it too hot, from saucer to cup and back again, while I stared at this, the second of wonders, surpassed only by my mother's father, calmly eating peas on a knife, and I not able to get my own in a spoon from the cracked plate to my mouth. It was forbidden to interrupt my grandfather at 12 sharp when he listened to the hog report and the other farmer news on the Cincinnati station. Chicago's decisions to pay us so much per pound for our pork and chickens and our bushels of grain, ripped from the fields surrounding the house, added to all the other fields worth across the land, that became what was talked of around the world. Marjorie Main is dead but a few days, my grandmother a few years more, but the memory of them both, causing me to laugh at their delightful interpretations of life, brings no real sadness now, but a bit of reflective love. As I remember the nights at the Heinz Theater while picking out the juju fruits from my molars, as I remember the days with my grandma slipping sugar into the Kool-Aid, and how I loved them both. The only tragic figures in the whole plot are those poor pieces of ham, curling and cringing in the skillet, sizzling their lives away on a wood-burning stove somewhere in a different age in Indiana.
Very good. And, and the thing you mentioned, and this is something that can relate, I think, to probably anybody, because as you were reading that, I remember my grandfather, who, whenever the coffee was there, he would take the cup and he would pour some into a saucer. Now, he didn't pour it back into the cup. He drank it from the saucer. And it always amazed me because I'm thinking, why does he do that? I didn't realize at the time, it was so it would be cool enough to drink.
Yes.
I tend to put an ice cube in mine if it's too hot, and then wonder why it cools down too fast.
Right, yeah.
Okay, that was a good one. And are there any others from that book that you'd like to read along with that, or do we want to go on to?
I think we go on to others.
Okay,
yeah,
we'll go on to another one.
Yeah. I would say that the book primarily is about growing up on the farm, so it covers a lot of different things.
And the title of that book, is it still available?
Yes,
is it still available?
Yeah, I haven't. If you go to my website, well, you can find copies. I don't sell them anymore on Amazon, but you can find them on there. But I have an Etsy store called Artful Words. Words is spelled with a Z on the end. Artful Words, and you can find a lot of my poetry and photography. Posters.
Artful, WORDZ.
Z, right.
Okay. And that will get you to your books, your poetry, your poetry books, your posters, and other information. Okay, that sounds good. One, waiting for Botox. I see that on your list. Do we want to go there? Or do we want to start?
Sure.
Because waiting for Botox, that has to be a little bit.
Well, sometimes. I deliberately, of course, make the title a little teasing. So if people just see the title, it's like, well, I have to read this, right? And you also, I was in the habit when I first wrote poetry of having the first line also be the title. And I still have some like that, and that's okay. But I try not to do that.
Yeah.
It's like you're belaboring it.
Well, they'll tell you don't judge a book by its cover, but the truth of the matter is we still judge books by their covers. So I think probably with poetry and with books too, we also use the titles, and you do that teasing type thing because you want to spark someone's interest. So, waiting for Botox.
Maybe my looks of surprise will now come from injections around my misbehaving eye instead of headlines of gossip and war. My wife wondered if I didn't need symmetrical treatment to avoid one side of feigned surprise and the other seemingly bored. But no matter how many needle jabs I endure, the misdeeds in Hollywood and Washington spread across the newspaper suffice to keep both eyebrows raised.
Okay, has that one been written recently? Because it sounds very, very timely.
Just a few years ago.
Okay,
yes,
I would think just even a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
could have been
yes,
appropriate.
that's true. Yes, sometimes these things are timeless.
They are
for good or bad. Right,
exactly. Yes. Okay. Let's see. Maybe next. Why don't we go to? I don't know. You pick the. What you want to read, because I'd like to. I'm enjoying this.
Okay, good. Well, I'll read one that is it's one of those. I've done 40-some posters of my poetry and photography that are combined, and so this particular one, the photo that goes with it is a photo I took of the Colosseum in Rome.
Okay.
So that it's important for people to know that I think before they hear the poem, but it's entitled Fort Wayne.
Okay, and Fort Wayne's in Indiana and the Colosseum in Rome. I'm glad you told me that.
Yeah.
So, okay, get a picture of the Colosseum in your mind as you hear John. Let's read this one.
And Fort Wayne was about 50 miles from our farm. And rather than come to Indianapolis, which was around 100 miles away, we went to Fort Wayne for the occasional shopping. We also went up there to its Coliseum for the Shriners Circus, and ice capades and basketball games and auto shows. Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. And nicely, it's still
a nice size city.
Yes, yeah, nice size city, and the Coliseum is still going. So we would often see people, from our neighbors or from our hometown because that's where we went for these things. So Fort Wayne. We never saw the irony of Christians cheering as Ringling's lions roared at us in the Fort Wayne Coliseum. Walking in the ruins of the Coliseum brought visions of animals eating people, the savagery of gladiators, swords thrust in, pulled out, and thrust again. Their cheers and laughter matched ours, given to the big-shoed, red-nosed performers, our applause matching theirs, commending the last gladiator. We were thumbs up for the hockey puck hit home, the ball sailing into the basket, the last second of the rivalry. The spangles and glitter skaters, she leaping and twirling, then descending perfectly into his arms. What was not to love about the Coliseum? Coney dogs were the bread of our circuses. We were always happy without even contemplating being safe from the growling lions in Fort Wayne, whose ancestors ate ours in Rome.
Okay, that's good. And I have seen the Coliseum, and it's when you view that, you think about the history and the lions and the gladiators. Yeah. So that was the picture there was painted well in your poetry. I think, John, we're going to need to take a break for a few minutes. So this is Nancy Zimmerman, and you are listening to A Look at the Bright Side. And I'm here today with John Sherman. We'll be right back in just a moment. Welcome back to A Look at the Bright Side with Nancy Zimmerman and friends. And I'm here today at Mound State Park in Anderson, Indiana, with John Sherman, who is photographer, poet, editor, publisher, a man of many talents, and we're going to spend the next few minutes having him read some of his poetry as we celebrate National Poetry Month. Okay, what are we going to listen to next?
Well, one that is one that I rewrote, and in looking at the original version, I really didn't like it very much, but I liked the emotion. When I was in college, President Kennedy was assassinated, and it was on a Friday, and I remember this very well. I found a few years ago notes that I had written. When I walked back, I was down on campus, I walked back to my dorm room and sat down and wrote this, and I didn't remember doing so. And so I had those notes to keep, and it's kind of a historic document now, right? But on the Sunday of the weekend, just the day before the funeral, my roommate and I decided, let's go. And it was an overnight drive, right? So he called his future brother-in-law in at Purdue, who had my roommate's car. My roommate we weren't old enough, he couldn't have a car on campus at the time. So he and two other people roared down from Purdue to Bloomington, picked us up. We drove all night long. I couldn't drive the stick shift, so I had to just ride along. No interstates at that time. So we're barreling through the mountains of West Virginia, and we get to Washington just as the sun came up, and it was a beautiful day, absolutely beautiful. And so this is also one of my posters. I have the photo of the caisson, the flag over the casket, as it's going along in this bright sunshine, and it's entitled "Attending JFK's Funeral." So years later, that first poem, I didn't really like it very much, so I rewrote it, and that's the one that appears on the poster, and that's the one I'm going to read now.
Okay.
Our silence allows us to hear the deadening march of hooves against the bridge, punctuated by camera shutters and bracelets jangling as they traverse the signs of the cross. Obscenely beautiful sunshine gives brilliance to the caisson's flag. Undeserved deep blue skies accentuate the tribute trails of jets. After the passing of limos of emperors, queens, and Kennedys, we walk to the Lincoln Memorial, sit trench-coated on its still green November grass, hear the graveside gun salute on our transistor radio, almost a second after it comes across the Potomac. Resist crying until taps hits us double, through the airwaves. His 1,000 days followed by our 4 of grief, now released as we rock back and forth, heads buried in our wet hands, suddenly feeling the chill.
It's good. Very good. And I think for those who did not live through that time, I don't know that they can appreciate the true feeling in this country when that happened, because there are some defining moments in history.
Yes.
And I think that for the United States, and I guess I'm getting a little bit politically oriented here, but I think for the United States that was perhaps the most defining moment of the 20th century, because it, in turn, the changes that were wrought because of his death and the trend, that the way that the United States turned diplomatically and politically because of the loss of his leadership has continues to affect us to this day. And I think somebody who didn't live through and I was not quite as old as you were. I was in high school rather than college, okay. But still, so you would have more of a political. Mine was a fell in love with Camelot and the handsome John Kennedy and the macaroni, the pony on the White House lawn, and the beautiful wife and the 2 cute kids. That's where I was coming from, rather than the immensity of what it would do, what the country really was happening because of that assassination. But it's a beautiful poem and a beautiful tribute, and it's to a very difficult day in our history. But how wonderful that you were able to experience that, because it adds a richness that you would not have been able to cover as thoroughly and as emotionally, not being there as to actually hear those hoofbeats, to hear those gunshots. That just really puts it in your pocket.
Well, and I don't know how many dozens of big black Cadillac limousines there were, but they pulled everyone in they possibly could to have them, because everyone had someone famous in it, and the camera wouldn't you could see into the limousine, but the glass was just shaded enough that that you couldn't get a photo. So because one of my slides just said LBJ or something, right. but you couldn't see anything. But every single one, people would be whispering Haile Selassie, Queen Frederica, Prince Philip,
Well, and that was before the day whenever the people would take selfies, and you would have a group of celebrities taking selfies at someone's funeral. I mean, now if something like that were to happen in places now, it would be plastered on social media. So the world is a lot different, and I'm not sure, but I don't miss the good old days.
Yes.
But these will be
this is actual film.
Yes, but these will be the good old days. This is what's scary. These will be the good old days 50 years from now. But you and I are probably not going to be here 50 years from now.
Well, I don't know.
Well, we might be. Don't discount that.
Botox.
Yes, I'm waiting for the Botox.
When the thing too, I didn't realize until a few years later that I had only taken about maybe 10 photos, and I thought later especially with digital and with all the kind of things where you can just edit as you go along and so forth, I would have shot dozens, if not hundreds, during that day. But I got this one photo that I used that was
really exemplifies what. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, what else do you have for us? These are very, very good, because I had not had a chance to, at the workshop, I'd had a chance to read 2 or 3 of your poems, and but we've got a much broader selection here.
Okay, well, here's one that reflects on the mounds, and I have written poems about the mounds. It's a similar kind of thing. It's called the Winter of '96, and the photo on this one is of Stonehenge.
Okay.
And
that's something that's identifiable to anybody listening
yes,
is
exactly.
Stonehenge.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was a very it was a vertical shot, so that I did some close-ups with zoom lens, but this was deliberately shot, standing at the ropes, and it was in February, so there were something like 4 or 5 of us there instead of hundreds and hundreds. So it was great because you could actually see them and stuff like this. But you got a certain distance away, and then I shot way up into the sky, and it got bluer and bluer as it went up. And but Stonehenge has always been, as to anybody who has heard about it, been there, done there, whatever. It's just so fascinating. And so is where we are today at the mounds. I mean, there's only so much they know about these mounds, and it's just the mystery of things.
It is a mystery.
Yeah, kind of interesting. So this one is, I just had kind of fun with this one too. The Winter of '96, which was 1996,
okay.
not 1896.
I thought 1996.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would really like to know how all magic tricks are done, but as soon as I find out, I want to forget. Having the brief, startling pleasure giving me for such a short time, my gods, and I'll be damned, gasping with belief and disbelief before I return to the pleasures of puzzlement. The same with these giant dominoes, having no idea how they arrived, how they were put upright, and the biggest question we so desperately want answered, why? If we could have had an ancient guide take a break between solstices, pull our faces down to his, whisper reality, then touch our ears, sucking out what had just made us gasp, with a "so that's it," and more I'll be damned. It would be nice to have it both ways now and then, from not knowing to not knowing. How women are sawn in half, or birds emerge from empty hats, how gigantic stones stand tall in this particular snowy field, and yet another winter of yet another '96.
Okay. Yes, because they have been there, the mounds have been here, they're not really even sure how long the mounds have been here, and I think it's about the same way with Stonehenge. They've just been.
Millennia.
Yes, and it is an amazing assemblage of stones over there. Okay.
I have one that's, I write a lot about social and political issues.
Okay.
Both poetry and otherwise. And this one's entitled Cages, and I've had this published a number of times. And the photo with this one, just happens that a number of these come from some of my posters, is actually a photo, and I put photos and poems together that aren't necessarily that exact place. Now, sometimes it is, that they, like the Kennedy one, actually exactly matches, the play, the photo, and the poem. This one is a photo actually of a young Nigerian boy during the Civil War when I was working with Red Cross, and we were working in a former prison. So he's looking through the bars into the room where we had the clinic. He's out in the open space in the center of that. So that's the image that you see.
So actually, he is free. He is out looking in, but the photo would not. You would not know that. Would it look more like he was in the cage?
Well, he was inside the prison itself. I mean, for protection.
Okay.
It was a refugee camp.
Okay.
Yeah. So the bars were there, I guess, to keep, when it was a prison, to keep prisoners from breaking into that room, whatever that room had been used for. Yeah.
Okay.
Or used for the clinic. Yeah. And it's just just staring through that. In Memphis, Tennessee, Tuesdays at the zoo were reserved for blacks, which is another way of saying Sundays, Mondays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were not. On Tuesdays only, the giraffes came onto the grass and let the boys and girls slide down their necks. On Tuesdays at the zoo in Memphis, Tennessee, peacocks brought forth 6 gorgeous feathers hidden in their tails for 6 days. On Tuesdays, flamingos lifted both feet in the air and remained aloft. On Tuesdays in Memphis, Tennessee, even the snakes behaved. My future wife chose a wildebeest to put golden flowers in her hair, then whispered to her of Serengeti. She placed her red shoes on his hind feet, and they danced, laughing, laughing. Finally, suddenly at 5 o'clock, little girls cried and hugged the bears goodbye. Cats licked boys' faces and rubbed their purring chins against nappy heads. The white guards awoke, and cage doors rang shut.
Wow. That's, yeah, very, very social commentary on that one.
And it's interesting to, I grew up in Indiana, as I mentioned, and was aware of, the Freedom Riders and the demonstrations and all these kinds of things going on. And we had George Wallace come to speak at IU, and many of us were protesting his appearance there. And he had gone around, we've been told he'd gone around, and one of the Civil Rights Acts, which Dr. King and others had pushed upon LBJ, and who was putting it through Congress and so on. So this was either for housing or voting or whatever. So this would have been around 1965 when a lot of those were passed. And so we found out that when he went to a campus, he would say, "How many of you have read this?" And most people, and then that would be his point, like, "We haven't read it, so how can you be critical of it?" Well, we were prepared. So they passed out copies of the bill. So we had them in our hands. So when he got to that point in his talk, he asked that, and dozens, if not a few hundred of us, held it up and waved it in the air. Now, to be true, I hadn't read it yet, but
you had a copy.
Still, yes, I had a copy. Well, he was taken aback because that was the first time that had happened. And I think after that, he changed his speech because he knew that was going to spread and so forth. So we're all caught right in the middle of this thing. But I knew, as many people knew, who didn't experience this and who were not, black, for example, of course, wherever they may have lived, but especially in segregated areas, truly segregated areas. I knew about, separate places to sit on the bus and separate entrances, the drinking fountains, and this kind of thing. But I didn't know how it permeated the culture and how you had it everywhere. And I had no idea that a zoo would be segregated or that a library would be segregated. I mean, a library.
I know. I just even recently found out about libraries being segregated. And I grew up in southern Indiana and in the 60s, and I did not realize until just within the last 5 or 6 years that within that community at the soda shop, the black citizens were not allowed to go in there. I mean, I was horrified because what I thought, John, I was like, okay, in the 60s, when I was in high school, if I had known that, would I have taken a stand and said, this is wrong? And sadly, I'm not sure I would have because well, for one thing, I don't think my parents would have allowed me to get that involved, but I'm not sure that I would have even realized that it was that big a deal. I don't, and I think we have these conversations. This always amazes me because when we talk about white privilege, it never occurs. Some of these situations, like with the library, like with other, it never occurs to me because I have never been not allowed a place because of the color of my skin. I may have not been allowed someplace because it was for men only and I was a woman, but never because of the color of my skin. So whenever we hear poems like this that so graphically depict the differences, I think it causes us to open our eyes and look at, regardless of when this was written, we still look and say, okay, society is still mirroring this. There are still places where you cannot go, you cannot participate because of your skin color, because of your gender, because of a variety of things. And I think it makes us more socially aware. So that I see as a real strength of poetry.
Yes, I think so.
Because it can be, poetry can be very succinctly, you can state something. If you do it in prose, it's like you kind of beat the drum, beat the drum, beat the drum. But with poetry, it just brings the emotion right to the top very quickly and gives it a chance to kind of brew for you to think about.
I think one of the things that I love about writing poetry and about reading poetry is that I also, as you mentioned, I write short fiction, what I call creative nonfiction, and I like to say, as many people do, I'm working on a novel, so which I've been working on for some time. But with a poem, you can take an idea that a whole novel investigates and comes to a conclusion, and in a few lines, a few stanzas,
it's resolved.
You get there, and that's what I think is. It's just you just pull it down like that. You know? It's like a sponge just soaking up something. You know, it's such a big idea, and you bring it down to that, and that's when you've written something like that. Even though you rewrite it, but when you get to a point where you are ready to share it, there's a certain pleasure about that, and maybe you're always kind of nervous. Are people going to not are they going to understand it? Because I hope that my poetry is very accessible, and I want it to be that way. And that's why I tell students in high school. I said when I was your age, I hated poetry until I discovered Robert Frost. So I had this rural connection with him. He wrote a lot about, even though it was about New England and the stone fences and things like this, right? Stone walls. And Carl Sandburg and Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman especially and so on. These people really got identified with. And then E. Cummings gave me the freedom to write the way it looks, without the capitalization, punctuation, and so on. So I had all those kinds of things. But these poems so often, not by these people, but by other people, they were impenetrable. And people today, of course, still write that way. And there's a certain attitude that I feel that they have that, I don't want you to understand. It's like, well, then why do you write this? If you are so arrogant to keep me out of this, or make me, just go crazy trying to understand it. And some of the anthologies in college, the poem might be a third of the page, and the footnotes were 2/3 of the page. And it wasn't just identifying a place; it was going into all these things like this. And I kept falling asleep trying to read these, for class, and becoming very resentful, and decided I was not going to write that way. You want to tease people, but you don't want to.
You want them to be able to you want them to be able to get the meaning. But I think too, as we discuss these, it's like once you read a poem begs to be discussed, I think, because you have a short, we have spent much more time discussing these poems than it took you to write the poem. Whereas, it can take months and months and sometimes years for people to write a book. So you read that and then you discuss that, and you discuss it in little bits and pieces. Whereas a poem, you can take the entire thing and it can provide you with conversation for an entire afternoon. But it's about one whole concept, one whole idea. And to be able to discuss an idea or an emotion for hours upon reading for 2 or 3 to 5 minutes, that just really, I think, gets the creative part of the mind focusing and really does something to the thought process. So I've never written poetry, but I do appreciate poetry. I appreciate good poetry. So we've got probably enough time for one more poem. The time has gone so quickly. And so can you pick out maybe the one that you have left that is your favorite of the ones left?
Yeah, this one, we visited Amsterdam and of course went to see the Anne Frank home. And I kind of like the idea of whether it's whatever type of writing you're doing, that it's a what if kind of thing. And this one is a what if poem. It's entitled Anne Frank, 1974.
Okay.
And the Prinsengracht, which is what I'll mention, is the street that her home was on. And of course, it's a museum today, and we went there to see it. And the ground floor is a welcome center, and I think they sell some things and so on. And then you go up, and when you get to the part where you go up to where the family is, or was, and it's chilling because you've read the book and you know the story, and you're in the actual place. So after we got back to the hotel that evening, I began working on this poem, and I worked on it for a very long time in different places, so I'm going back home. But I wanted to, it's one of those that you wish so hard that this were true, what I write. And it was written in 74. That's the reason for that. Anne Frank, 1974. Across the Prinsengracht, Anne Frank leaned out the window, called to her children, then smiled at me before removing her plain-colored coat. I rubbed my nose, felt the back of my neck, and a nervousness, born of a joy at seeing her standing at her window, squinting in the evening sun as it made its way for the darkening sky, hinting of stars. I adjusted the collar of my coat and walked off into the evening, whistling a tune, thinking of Anne Frank at 45, wiping her hands on her apron as she called down to her children, kicking a ball along the canal, telling them to come up for supper. I too would have kept a diary up in the attic and would have worried those wonderfully mundane worries in the days before the Nazi seized me. And just before she pulled the window shut, I would have her rub her nose, look at me as I looked back at her, and wave, then brush back her graying hair and smile for her good life and her past, untarnished by boots and thumps in the night on the stairs leading to the attic where she and the others hid so safely for so long.
Okay, that would be, yes, that is definitely a what if.
Yes.
And we find that too, I think there are a lot of parallels right now we're seeing in the world with the world that existed during the time of Anne Frank, because we're seeing all in different countries people who are under attack and who have to hide, who have to take refuge some way, shape, or form. And here again, our white privilege, our white American privilege, doesn't always extend to those who have been born in other places where there's not quite so much forgiveness. And I think we need to take a lesson from the life of Anne Frank. So, our time is just about up, John, but to get in touch with you or to get your books or your posters or just to view your work, it's again...
Yes, the Etsy, well, I can give you two things. One is the website, which gives you more information. I don't have to say it then spell it.
Say it and then spell it. We've got that time.
Okay. It's Mesa Verde Press. And I chose that because we lived on Mesa Verde Street in Santa Fe when I first started this. Okay. So it's www.m as in mother, ESA, V as in Victor, ERDE, press, PRESS.com. So Mesa Verde Press. Okay. And then that takes you to the opera that I've written, the performance of the portion that's been scored about Biafra. Also, it takes you to the art tab, takes you to the Etsy store, which is, you want to go there directly, you can go to Artful Words, words with a Z. And that
Artful,
will
have... ARTFULWORDZ.
Correct. Yes, okay. Yes, yeah, an Etsy. And that has posters, photos, books, those things. And then what I do is, on the store, you see the image of the poster, for example, or of course, just the plain photo, but then they give you room to give a description. So in the Anne Frank one, for example, the photo that goes with that one was taken in Canada. But I felt that it reflected very much my feeling, and I'd already written the poem, and I saw this image of this home, these windows with the blinds closed and so forth, and I thought that would go with that. Yes, it has that silence, that secrecy, and so on. Okay. That's described in the text that goes with these.
Okay. Well, we look forward to having you on again and
thank you.
A look on the bright side. And thank you so much for taking the time today. And for those of you who are listening, thank you very much for listening in. And remember that no one ever ruined their eyesight by taking a look at the bright side. Take care and tune in again.